The science of human action, I confess to you, is not necessarily the most scintillating thing you would hear first thing. I have an hour to talk at most. I don't want to take an hour. I want to leave time for questions. So let me summarize in a simple and straightforward way, I hope, this thing, the science of human action. As I say, I'll do so in an introductory way with a bit of levity, chuckling at the misfortunes of our philosophical opponents. Here's a vital distinction that underlies my talk, and to keep it in mind as I proceed through the talk. In the physical world, nobody really knows why, for example, a stone falls when you drop it, why it falls from your hand to the ground. The best that physical scientists can do is to invent physical laws within quotations, that seem to describe quite accurately the empirical observations, namely the stone that falls from your hand to the ground. Those empirical observations describe reality as closely as possible. That's the physical world. But when it comes to our actions, the actions of human beings, we do know something about their actual cause. Unlike the physical scientist, who doesn't ultimately know, he has a theory, he has a model, we can, I think, we're on good grounds, on very solid grounds, and we say, yes, we can do better than that. We know something that physical scientists are not in a position to know. We know that each of us acts, hence the phrase human actions. We do know something about actual causes. Each of us has preferences. Mine will differ from yours will differ from the person seated beside you, but each of us has preferences, and each of us uses available means in order to achieve those preferences, those desired ends. In his book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis, the noted poet, theologian, expressed in very plain English the gist of what I want to say to you today. It's worth quoting him. There's one thing, and only one, in the whole universe which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. That one thing is man, by which he means mankind, humankind. We do not merely observe men in humankind, we are people. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. I'll read another paragraph, the following paragraph from C.S. Lewis. Lewis goes on. Notice the following point. Anyone studying man from the outside, as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not able to get inside information from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. He's discussing it in the context of a moral law. How could he? For his observations would only show what we did, and the moral law is about what we ought to do. In the same way, if there is anything above or beyond, if there were anything above or behind the observed facts, in the case of stones or the weather, we, by studying them from the outside, could never hope to discover it. In the plainest of English, and paraphrasing C.S. Lewis and translating it into secular language, just as the moral law, as C.S. Lewis describes it, is written in our hearts, so too is the axiom of human action. That much we know. We know it because it's irrefutable. That gets me to Mises. The most distinctive and most fundamental feature of the economics of Mises, and of that of his major followers, Rothbard, Hoppe, etc., is its a priori approach. Mises' economics proceeds a priori from the axiom of human action. What on earth does that phrase, a priori, mean? It means knowledge that comes before or irrespective of sense experience, what you can see, what you can feel, what you can touch. Human action, in a sense, is human nature, and the science of human action is fundamental knowledge about this aspect of our nature. Again, in order to obtain that knowledge, we resort to introspection and to deduction rather than through external observation and induction. For Mises then, and for Rothbard, Hoppe, and so on, economic science, the science of human action, is a collection of laws. These laws in turn have been validly, that's to say, logically deduced from that axiom. The structure is built on the fundamental axiom of action, as well as a few subsidiary assumptions axioms. Give an example. Individuals' goals vary, which I've already mentioned, such that yours differs from the person sitting next to you, which differs from the third person, etc. Also, people regard leisure as a consumer good. As some subsidiary axioms, goods and services are scarce, production must precede consumption, saving must precede production, etc. From those very, very simple statements, if you've read or begun to read something like Rothbard's book, Man, Economy and State, something like 1,200 pages, basically those 1,200 pages are logical deductions from those elementary beginning fundamental axiom. Assuming that that axiom is true, and that the reasoning deduced from them is valid, then these laws of economics, the laws of human action, as Mises describes them, are just as valid as the laws, say, of Euclidean geometry. Just as it's absurd to test the laws of maths with data, that's to say, to attempt to falsify those laws of maths with data, it's equally absurd to test the laws of economics, as Mises conceives them. Data can help us to describe, to illustrate these laws, contending bits and pieces here and there, but they certainly cannot disprove them. So, knowledge about human action, that's where that word praxeology comes into discussion. Knowledge about human action, praxeology as Mises describes it, doesn't derive from observation, experience, empirical evidence, and the like. Knowledge about human action comes from introspection, deduction, rather than observation. And this axiom is self-evidently true. It's true for all human beings, at all times, in all places, and cannot even conceivably be violated. Think a bit about that. We can conceive of a world where resources are not varied. Joseph Stalin tried to do that. But we simply cannot conceive of a world where human beings exist but do not act. Human action is self-evident in this sense. Nobody can deny the truth of that axiom without self-contradiction. To deny human action is in effect to undertake an act of human action. So by trying to refute, you affirm the very thing which you are trying to disprove. Let me give you some immediate implications, actually, before I go to this, some predictions, some implications of all of this. Very simple starting points, but as I said, in Rothbard's case, there's 1,200 pages of implications of that. Some immediate implications of this axiom of human action. For a start, it implies that individuals' behavior is purposeful, it's intentional. In short, each individual is directed towards certain goals. Further, the fact that each individual acts implies that he's consciously chosen certain means to achieve his goals. Because he wishes to attain particular goals, they must be valuable to him or to her. Accordingly, that person must have values which govern choices. That the individual employs means implies he believes he has technological knowledge, that certain means will achieve his desired ends. Notice then that praxeology does not assume, I'll repeat that, praxeology, Mises' axiom of human action, does not assume that a person's choice of values or goals is wise or proper, that he has chosen the technologically correct means or the best means of achieving his or her goals. All that praxeology asserts is that individual actor adopts goals and believes, whether erroneously or not, that he can arrive at them by the employment of certain means. So what Mises calls human action is not the same thing as what mainstream economists mean when they say rational action. Mises assumes nothing whatsoever about the rationality of human action. And in fact, read human action carefully in this particular context. Mises doesn't use the term rational at all. He assumes nothing about the wisdom of man's ends or about the correctness of his means. He only contends that men and women act, that they have some ends, and that they use means to try to attain them, whether successfully or not. All action in the real world, moreover, must necessarily take place through time. All action takes place in some present, in the now, and is directed towards the future, whether it's the immediate future or the more distant future, towards the attainment of some goal in the future. Why is that? Well, if your ends could be instantaneously realized, there'd be no reason at all to undertake action as Mises conceives it. The fact that man acts implies that he believes action will make a difference, to use the contemporary phrase. In other words, the man or the woman will prefer this state of affairs rather than that one, and will undertake action which he or she best believes will attain it. Action therefore implies that man does not have omniscient knowledge of the future. For if a man or a woman had omniscient knowledge, no action on his or her part would make the slightest bit of difference. So action implies, we can deduce already from Mises' axiom, that we live in a world of uncertain, in which the future is uncertain, or not fully certain. I'm using uncertainty there. I'll borrow a bit from the mainstream in the sense that Frank Knight used it. And for statisticians in the crowd, I'm drastically simplifying to the point of oversimplification. An uncertain world or an uncertain future is one in which you cannot attach a probability distribution. I know I'm virtually oversimplifying there, but that's the gist. A person asked me last night, discussing the role of econometrics in all of this. Well, if you can't, or with only the most incredible difficulty or unrealistic assumptions can fit a probability distribution, those methods might not be important. I'll return to that point and possibly through your questions. The fact that people act implies that the means employed are scarce in relation to the desired ends. For if all means were not scarce, if they were superabundant, then the ends would already have been attained, and there'd be no action to attain them. Stated another way, resources that are superabundant, like the air that we're breathing just at this minute, they might be indispensable to life, and indeed they're indispensable in one sense to maintain our life, but they're outside the scope of human action. If air is not superabundant, that's to say, last night coming back on a very, very humid evening in Sydney, I wanted not just air, but air of a particular temperature at a particular point in time. That became a scarce good, and indeed I did pay for it. If we were in Hobart this morning, we'd likely would be wanting air of, on the other side of the scale, warmer air rather than the superabundant air that we're breathing now. So even in the absurdly, well, I'd say flatly impossible, re-advent of some sort of a Garden of Eden in which all goods are superabundant, and indeed a few years ago people were talking about it in serious phrases, a post-materialist, post-scarcity sort of a society. Even in that sort of a situation in which all desires could be fulfilled instantaneously, there'd be at least one scarce means, namely the individual's time, each unit of which, if allocated to one purpose, necessarily could not be allocated to some other goal. So the most elementary deductions, we have uncertainty and time through which action occurs. So we have Mises' a priori approach, deductive approach. It's diametrically, and it seems to me, irreconcilably different from the mainstream's approach. The mainstream is, let me use the word positive, harking after Milton Friedman, a collection of essays on positive economic science and his contribution to it, the method of economic science circa 1953 or 54. That positive mainstream method is, and that inductive method, that's the method of today's economic mainstream. If his a priori knowledge derives from introspection, then positive knowledge stems from sense experience, from induction, from observation of the external world. So in a word, today's mainstream are positivists in the sense that Friedman used it. In their view, economics can be scientific only if it mimics the procedures used by natural scientists. And I mentioned physical sciences very, very briefly in the first couple of sentences of my presentation. Roughly, positivists make two, in effect, normative claims. They claim first that scientists should form hypotheses which possess empirically testable implications. Second, scientists then should collect data, particularly quantitative data, with which to assess the correspondence of these data to these hypotheses' implications. To the positivist mainstream, these hypotheses, the ones that fit the data better, are deemed to be preferable to the conjectures that seem to fit the data less well. So for Mises, truth relies in valid deduction from that irrefutable axiom of human action. For the positivist mainstream, they don't much like to talk about truth, not that they deny truth, but basically truth in kind of statistical terms or econometric terms, well, the higher the R squared, the bigger the T value, somehow the closer to the truth that becomes. So notice there's some fundamentally divergent starting points which it seemed to me lead to some irreconcilable differences. The real problem of the 20th century, here's the problem, was the problem of mainstream economics. The problem of mainstream economics in the 20th century, and indeed today, is that economists picked the wrong analogy, namely that analogy with the physical world. They thought, in effect, economists still think today, mainstream economists still think, in effect, that they're natural scientists. They certainly behave as if they were natural scientists. They thought that economics could and indeed should be treated as a branch of science, of physical science that is, where bounded problems could be reduced to numbers and manipulated and solved. The trouble, though, of course, is that there ain't no such thing. There are no controlled experiments. There simply are no constant of human behavior. Notice I'm using the word behavior rather than of human action. And there are no reproducible results, quite frankly. No hypotheses that can be ever disproven. Why do I mention this? And indeed, I'm happy to harp on it. That's why the worst ideas in mainstream, they arise again and again and again and again and again. Oh, let's try inflation in the 19th century. Didn't much work, led to various sorts of disasters. Let's try it in the 1930s. Oh, didn't work then, led to various disasters. Oh, says Ben Bernanke, let's try it again today. Perhaps we'll be third time lucky. If their starting point is wrong, it seems to me that their endpoints are going to be wrong. Let me interject a note of levity. Let's vote for Saturday morning and a humid Saturday morning. That's reasonably heavy sledding. An immediate point comes to the fore. Let me quote from Mises. Not this quote, which I'll discuss in just a minute, but the point to do with prediction. For the mainstream, prediction is a very big ticket item. If I can predict somehow better than you, then my approach is better than yours. The mainstream, to the extent that they pay any attention to Mises and Austrians at all, mostly they mock them, but well, hang on, you haven't models, therefore you can't predict, therefore shut up. In Human Action, Mises wrote, economics as he conceives it, that is, deduced from the laws of the axiom of human action, can predict the effects to be expected from resorting to definite measures of economic policies. It can answer the question whether a definite policy is able to attain the ends aimed at, and, if the answer is in the negative, what its real effects will be. But of course, this prediction can only be qualitative and cannot be quantitative, as there are no constant relation between the factors and the effects concerned. The practical value of economics, again as he conceives it, is to be seen in this neatly circumscribed power of predicting the outcome of definite measures. Let me then ask the question, and at the mainstream's expense, who in effect predicts better? Mises, for starters, predicted the collapse of socialism. And I point out, not too gently, he did so in 1920. You can read the quote as well as I can, so we'll both read. One may anticipate the nature of the future socialist society. Remember, this is in 1920, a mere 3 years after Lenin began his killings in Russia. There will be hundreds and thousands of factories in operation. In the ceaseless toil and moil of this process, however, the administration will be without any means of testing their bearings. In place of the economy of the, quote, anarchic, unquote, method of production, recourse will be had to the senseless output of an absurd apparatus. The wheels in turn will run, but to no effect. That's Mises. What has the mainstream to say? Paul Samuelson, author of probably the most widely read over the decade, published since 1948 in something like 20 English language editions, heaven knows how many non-English language editions. Timing not so great, 1989. The Soviet economy is proof that, contrary to what many skeptics, perhaps like what Mises believed, a socialist command economy can function and even thrive. It is vital, folks, it is vital, I'll repeat this again and again and again, to laugh at the mainstream. They talk about their predictions, but the biggest prediction of the 20th century, they are four square, full set, dead set, wrong. It's important to remember that and to keep that in mind. If we don't learn the lessons of the 20th century, folks, the 20th century and the tens of millions of deaths of victims of the state, those deaths will be in vain. A lot rides on this. The preeminent issue of that century, like today, is capitalism versus socialism, i.e. a decentralized market economy in which free men and women make their own decisions, succeed or fail, but stand on their own 2 feet. That's option A. Option B, people who think they know damn well better for the rest of us, and if we don't like it, well then that's just too bad. Option B is central planning by an elite who are convinced that they know better than the rest of us. It seems to me, as a predictive science, Mises is streets ahead of Samuelson and the mainstream. Friedrich Hayek, I'm being slightly naughty here because his economics is not the praxeological economics of Mises, but as I say, I'm being naughty. In the Austrian Institute of Economic Research, the bulletin, February 1929, the boom will collapse within a few months. One of the most prominent mainstream economists of his day, Irving Fisher, 16th of October 1929. Alas, within a week or so of the beginning of the crash in Wall Street, stocks have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. At this stage, when I have discussions with mainstream folks, in effect the response is, well, Hayek got lucky and Fisher got unlucky. Okay. Ben Bernanke, to put it mildly, there are you've seen them, no doubt, you've read about them, various quotes from Ben Bernanke. He was as attentive to Mr. Magoo to economic troubles between 2000 and 2005. House prices have risen by nearly 25% over the past 2 years. Speculative activity, maybe, national level, blah, blah, blah. Reflects strong economic fundamentals, including robust growth in jobs and incomes, low mortgage rates, thanks to you-know-who, steady rates at household formation factors, and blah, blah, blah. In other words, folks, nothing here to see. Go home. It's all good. Ron Paul bloody well saw the global financial crisis coming. High price inflation should not have been a surprise, given that the Fed has increased the money supply by 25% during the period 2001 to 2003. Given the government's encouragement of lax lending practices, home prices could crash, bankruptcies would increase, and financial companies, including government-sponsored mortgage companies, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, etc., might require another taxpayer bailout. You tell me who got it closer to the truth, Ron Paul or Helicopter Ben. And now we turn to Paul Krugman. Who cannot fail to adore Paul Krugman? Paul Krugman is screaming out to be laughed at, so let us oblige him. 2002. To fight this recession, the Fed needs soaring household spending to offset moribund business investment. And to do that, Alan Greenspan needs to create a housing bubble to replace the NASDAQ bubble. Well, in actual fact, Alan Greenspan did create a housing bubble to replace the NASDAQ bubble, and a lot of bloody good that did for tens or hundreds of millions of people around the world. It seems to me that Ron Paul got it much more accurately than, to put it very, very, very mildly, than Paul Krugman. The Onion, many of you read. I read it because it is a much more reliable source of economic and financial information than the Wall Street Journal. It's worth quoting at length from one of their allegedly mock articles, which in actual fact is far closer to the truth than the mainstream might think. Let me read, there's several paragraphs before the quote before I get to this one. Here we go. According to a story from the Onion, 14th of July 2008, a panel of top business leaders testified before Congress about the worsening recession on Monday, demanding that the government provide Americans with a new, irresponsible, and largely illusory economic bubble in which to invest. Quote, what America needs right now is not more talk and long-term strategy, but a concrete way to create more imaginary wealth in the very immediate future, unquote, said Thomas Jenkins, CFO of the Boston area Jenkins Financial Group, a bubble-based investment firm. Quote, says Mr. Jenkins, we are in a crisis, and that crisis demands an unviable short-term solution, unquote. The Onion continues. The current economic woes brought on by the collapse of the so-called housing bubble are considered the worst to hit investors since the equally untenable dot-com bubble burst in 2001. According to investment experts, now that the option of making millions of dollars in a short period of time with imaginary profits from bad real estate deals has disappeared, the need for another spontaneous make-believe source of wealth has never been more urgent. Congress is currently considering an emergency economic stimulus measure, tentatively called the Bubble Act, which would order the Federal Reserve to begin encouraging massive private investment in some fantastical financial scheme in order to get the nation's false economy back on track. And pièce de résistance, the concluding paragraph of the Onion's piece, demand for a new investment bubble began months ago when the subprime mortgage bubble burst and left the business world without a suitable source of pretend income. But as more and more time has passed with no substitute bubbles forthcoming, investors have begun to fear that the worst-case scenario, an outcome known among economists as real-world repercussions, may be inevitable. Every American family deserves a false sense of security, said Chris Repto, a risk analyst for Citigroup in New York. Once we have a bubble to provide a fragile foundation, we can begin building a pyramid scheme on top of a pyramid scheme. And before we know it, the financial situation will return to normal. America needs another bubble, said Chicago investor Bob Taken. At this point, bubbles are the only thing keeping us afloat. As much as anything, better than virtually everything, the bubble encapsulates the sheer tomfoolery and the laughable state of contemporary economics and finance. Why verbal logic? Another bugbear for the mainstream. The Misesians aren't statistically, mathematically oriented. Their logic, their deductions are verbal deductions. Therefore, they're not worth paying any attention to. Why do the followers of Mises embrace verbal logic and reject mathematical logic? The simplest answer is that, again, I return to that point about truth and realism, dropping stones, etc. People think and hence act in terms of verbal language, not in terms of mathematical language. The stone doesn't think, so you can model mathematically its descent. A human being does act, but acts verbally and not mathematically. Take the implications of the concept of action, as Mises develops them, and try to re-express them in a mathematical form. Even if you could, I doubt you can, but you're welcome to try, what would you have accomplished except a drastic loss of meaning at each step of the deductive process? So it's worth repeating what I said at the outset. In the physical world, nobody really knows why that stone falls. Physicists will talk about Newton's laws of physics, etc., laws of gravity, and so on, to describe the empirical observation, and those laws do a very good job of describing that physical reality. But when it comes to human action, the actions of human beings, we know something that physicists are never in a position to know. We know something about actual, ultimate causes. Each of us acts. Each of us necessarily and indisputably, irrefutably acts. So maths is perfectly appropriate in physics. In physics, axioms and deductions are purely formal. They only acquire meaning in an operational sense if they describe reality accurately. And that's where Friedman borrows with economics. He's legendary for saying, and quite forthright and robust in saying, of course mainstream assumptions are unrealistic. We're actually proud of that because it renders our models mathematically tractable and therefore the predictions somehow closer to reality. In sharp contrast, in praxeology, in Mises' conception, in the analysis of human action, the axioms themselves are known and the deductions at each stage are true. To deduce something validly from a true statement is itself a true statement. So each step of the process, each word of Rothbard's man, economy, and state is true because it's a valid deduction from those initial axioms. Keynes was scarcely a follower of Mises. He was also a clumsy writer and it seems to me an execrable economist. He was, however, a very good mathematician. And indeed, it seems to me he was far, far better at maths than he was at economics. Here's what Keynes had to say about mathematical symbolism in economics. It is a great fault of symbolic pseudo-mathematical methods of formalizing a system of economic analysis that too large a proportion of recent mathematical economics are mere concoctions, as imprecise as the initial assumptions they rest on, which allow the author to lose sight of the complexities and interdependencies of the real world in a maze of pretentious and unhelpful symbols. It seems to me Keynes himself denounces Keynesianism just as well as Mises does, at least in this particular extract. I'm sensitive to time. I'll make one more major point. Actually, a couple, but this is an important one. Praxeology, the science of human action, is not the same thing as psychology. And Mises very clearly specified a dividing line between the two. Psychology creates and tests theories to explain why people choose certain ends. Why did I choose objective A rather than B, C, or D? Why did you choose objective D rather than E, E, or F? And why did the person in the far corner of the room choose objective X rather than Y or Z? why people choose certain ends. Praxeology, as Mises conceives it, on the other hand, derives logical implications from the a priori, before experience fact that people have ends and that they pursue them. What those ends are, again, is going to vary from individual to individual. Given this difference, it may be, for all I know, and I've never sat in as much as a single lecture in psychology, perfectly appropriate for psychologists to collect data and conduct experiments in order to test their hypotheses. Because of this difference, it seems to me, though, I'm certain that it's simply misguided for economists to similarly ape the method of physics and, of that matter, of psychology in trying to consider economic matters. An example, a psychological law to contrast with a Misesian praxeological law. To illustrate the difference, two laws from these respective disciplines. One example, psychologists have conducted many experiments which seem to confirm something called the bystander effect. In plain English, a person is less likely to come to the assistance of another person, a stranded motorist, for example, if a large number of other bystanders is also present. Why is this? Say psychologists, a person who drives by a stranded motorist in a large city will think, well, somebody else, better, more able, more suitable than me, is going to stop and help that person. On the other hand, a person who encounters a stranded motorist in a rural area will realize that he's the only one who can help. So paradoxically, it's possible that a person is more likely to receive assistance in a relatively deserted area than in the middle of Martin Place in Sydney. Now, the bystander effect sounds plausible and indeed seems consistent with personal experiences, or at least mine, but is it a scientifically validated hypothesis? The best and perhaps only way to test it is to conduct controlled experiments. We can make no a priori deductions about the validity of the bystander effect, since we have no self-evident axioms that would lead to its particular deduction. It's not enough to test the average response time in a big city versus a rural area, because we mightn't be dealing statistically with the same population. Perhaps people in big cities like Sydney and Melbourne are just rude, for example, compared to folks in country towns. So, psychologists have conducted experiments, and these experiments have tended to affirm, not my phrase, tended to affirm, i.e. they've tended not to falsify the hypothesis. And indeed, says Wikipedia, quote, the bystander effect is one of the strongest and most replicable effects in social psychology. Now, this confirmation doesn't prove the universal truth of the bystander effect. Although it's unlikely, perhaps despite the best efforts, psychologists haven't somehow selected proper, randomly selected experimental groups. Moreover, even if the bystander effect is a fact today, might there be some sort of development, technological or otherwise, which renders it, which vitiates it in the future? Do people in different cultures somehow respond to bystanders in a different way? So any statistically generated law is going to be, by definition, a tentative one. Compare that to a praxeological law, a Misesian law. For example, if the stock of money is increased, then we know for certain that it will lower the exchange value of that unit of money. We know that the law of diminishing marginal utility, Kalamenga's original variant, then elaborated by Mies, we know that the law of diminishing marginal utility presupposes the axiom of human action. That is, the axiom of human action underlies and subsumes the law of diminishing marginal utility. That law says that the utility to its consumer of an additional good or service declines if the supply of the good increases. Remember, this is a praxeological law, not a psychological statistical generalization. It follows from this law that an additional unit of money in one's possession can only be employed as a means of removing an uneasiness that's deemed less urgent than the one that's so far been satisfied by an unchanged volume of money. So we can therefore say with certainty that a rise in the stock of money necessarily reduces the exchange value of a unit of money. We cannot, of course, use this a priori proposition or a priori propositions like this one to make precise quantitative forecasts. We don't know when, by how much the exchange value of a given unit of money is going to decline, if and when the stock of money rises. We do know a priori, that is, in advance and without having to run a social experiment, whether or not a given action or policy measure can or cannot bring about the effects. We know that there'll be an inflationary effect. Precise timing, precise quantity, alas, is beyond us. Let me skip through my notes. I'm sensitive to time. Just a bit of contemporary application. Can fiat, unsound money last? As a few kind of parenthetical remarks, perhaps just to whet the appetite and conclude. What light can Mises, can the axiom of human action, bring to bear on this key question? Can a regime of fiat, that's to say government-imposed money, can it last, or does it necessarily collapse? I'll make a couple of points. First is that ongoing injections of fiat money to fight, within quotations, a crisis caused in the first place by the production of fiat money, that prevents the liquidation of unprofitable investment. Ben Bernanke, are you listening? Glenn Stevens, are you listening? They can be repeatedly, these malinvestments can be repeatedly financed at lower rates of interest and therefore appear to be profitable. That's point one. Point two, artificially suppressed rates of interest. Once again, Ben Bernanke et al., are you listening? Brought about by an expansion of bank credit, encourage investment projects that would not have been undertaken if the market rate of interest had not been pushed down by central bank policies. Consequences of these things, Mises wrote about it in The Theory of Money and Credit in 1912, English translation, early 1950s, Rothbard, etc., etc. Of course, a fiat money regime cannot last. When does it collapse? We don't know. What's the extent of its dissolution? Again, we can't say precisely. What we can say, as early as 1923, if I can, let's see, that'll be my last slide. As early as 1923, Mises had this to say. If a government is not in a position to negotiate loans and does not dare levy additional taxation for fear that the financial and general economic effects will be revealed too clearly too soon. Let me repeat this in light of the so-called falsely named, by the way, fiscal cliff in America. I'll repeat that. If a government is not in a position to negotiate loans and doesn't dare levy additional taxation for fear of the financial and general economic effects will be revealed too clearly too soon, so that it will lose support for its program, it always considers it necessary to undertake inflationary measures. Congress will fudge, Ben Bernanke will inflate. Thus, inflation becomes one of the most important psychological aids to an economic policy which tries to camouflage its effects. By deceiving public opinion, it permits a system of government to continue which would have no hope of receiving the approval of the people if conditions were frankly explained to them. That's Mises in 1923. It seems to me that ought to be, but certainly it's not going to be on the front pages of the newspaper headlines on the TV news bulletins. So, praxeologically, through the axiom of human action, the way back to liberty is to think clearly and properly about money, amongst other things, and to think clearly and properly about sound money. I conclude in Mises' words. The belief that a sound money system can once again be attained without making substantial changes in economic policy is a serious error. What's needed first and foremost is to renounce all inflationist fallacies. This renunciation cannot last, however, if it's not firmly grounded on a full and complete divorce of ideology from all imperialist, militarist, protectionist, statist, and socialist ideas. It seems to me what we're here to do today is to refute and to combat imperialist, militarist, protectionist, statist, and socialist ideas. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention this morning, and I'm happy to answer questions. In front. Do we have a procedure with a microphone to answer questions? Wash or Samuel? Yep. There's a gentleman. First hand I saw, which might have been the first hand, a gentleman in the first row.
My name is Peter Brun. Does Warren Buffett understand Austrian economics?
No, in a word. The question is, just to make sure everyone heard it, the question was, does Warren Buffett, the super sage, the super investor from Omaha, does he understand Austrian economics? In a word, no, I don't think so. But it seems to me his father certainly did. There is more than a bit of evidence that his father undertook a correspondence with none other than Murray Rothbard during the 1950s. Their views on several things, critically, what is money, the origins of money, what is inflation, what are the origins and consequences of inflation, of an interventionist foreign policy were lock, stock, and barrel in full agreement. So, alas, the wisdom, in this case, I guess it happens quite often, the wisdom of the father is not imparted to the son. second hand I saw, but it might be someone else. Along the road there on the, let's see. Keep going, straight ahead. Yep.
I was just wondering, what questions do Austrian economists think are empirical? Because there are some questions that are probably empirical. And how was Hayek different from Mises in that respect?
Let's see. I'll take the second question first and express some mild ignorance, because it's been a fair while, probably a decade, since I read Hayek with any great detail or indeed with interest, and that's not a slide on Hayek, that's reflecting my ignorance. And I'll refer to, let's see, for Mises, and I'll drastically simplify to the point of oversimplification, Mises, as you probably know, wrote a book called Theory and History. In a praxeological sense, history is still fundamentally important. What is the purpose of history, in this case economic and financial history, is to demonstrate the application, how these laws work out in real life. I'll give you a trivial example. I'm away from home over the weekend. I flip the switch when I return, and nothing happens. Does that falsify the laws of thermodynamics, the fact that the light doesn't work? Or does it mean I should look at the fuse box to see whether the fuse has gone out? Or should I look at my records to see whether or not I've paid the electricity bill? In other words, the laws with respect to electricity are laws, and they work in all times, in all places. The fact that my electricity, when I flipped the switch, the electricity didn't come on, there can be some other, call it, initial conditions which swamp that or subsume it. Why is it then that Bernanke's inflation has not yet appeared, or Glenn Stevens' inflation has not appeared at the supermarket checkout counter? In Gough Whitlam's day and in Malcolm Fraser's day, inflation appeared at the checkout at Coles in Woolies. In the past 20 years or so, inflation has appeared in stock and bond markets. Same law, but different. River of inflation flows, but the tributaries are running in different directions. So that's, it seems to me that that's Mises' approach to the role of economic history and to empirical research, generally speaking. How does Hayek fit in? And again, getting back to my point about ignorance, it's been quite a while. Hayek, not being a strict Misesian praxeologist, is not nearly of the same, call it, nearly as strict in saying, ultimate truth comes from within. There is some truth, it seems to me, but there's, I think, a presentation about Hayek later on. Perhaps I'm flatly wrong to say that truth can be induced externally. That would be my first blush take to answer to the question. But again, I'll emphasize the third time, a relative ignorance about Hayek. In the front, I saw a hand. Andrew, I think it was.
Hi, Andrew. In mainstream, in today's world, business or private industry hires economists to create models for forecasting so that they can then use that forecasting for production means. What's your opinion on praxeology or praxeology's role for private industry, if that exists, or is it purely just for academia?
Let's see. The short answer, and I'll try to keep it short, and again, it's an excellent question, not that I have a particularly good answer, is read Israel Kirzner. That's to say, it is not the role of the businessman to forecast, it is the role of the businessman or woman to observe the market and to act in the market, to serve the ends of consumers. So in other words, as an entrepreneur, for the sake of argument, in the software industry, a prediction about GDP or the bank bill rate next year avails you nothing, as opposed to your knowledge from running around in the world and saying, person X is prepared to pay price Y for a piece of software Z. In other words, forecast per se, it seems to me, are next to useless. For some corporations, and by no means all, their approach is not forecasting per se, but to say, what can seriously go wrong, and what can we do to mitigate that? In other words, rather than, in econometric terms, rather than trying to make a point estimate, they say, what's the confidence interval? And if it's towards the bottom of that confidence interval, what's the probability we find ourselves in severely deep trouble. So in other words, the good will take care of itself, but let's see what we can do under the bad conditions. So my halfway answer to your question is, say, looking not at the point estimate, but at the confidence interval. But more generally, it seems to me, for an entrepreneur in the market, a forecast per se is, well, it's basically useless. That entrepreneur may well have knowledge which is not dependent upon the success or otherwise of a particular forecast.
Yes, does Kahneman and Thaler and those guys, are they Austrian economists? The behavior-
Daniel Kahneman and Thaler and those. The short answer is no. It seems to me they're not. Not that I've read much of them. Again, I'm oversimplifying. For folks like Daniel Kahneman, which, by the way, was not a winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. There is no Nobel Prize in Economics. I'll rant about that in a minute. There was a Bank of Sweden Prize in honor of Alfred Nobel, which is financed by the Central Bank of Sweden, but not the Nobel Foundation, the explosives folks. In effect, he's applying insights from psychology into finance and economics. And again, I'm vastly oversimplifying. But no, that would be, he'd be far more a psychologist, and I mean this not as criticism, but more a psychologist than a praxeologist. His is very much an empirical approach and not a deductive a priori approach. One more question.
Good morning. Funny question, this one, and it's opinion only. Had Keynes lived longer, do you think he would have repealed some of his fundamental law of economics, or did he just die a narcissist?
The question was, I missed bits of it, but if Keynes died, I think, in 1946, 46, because he was at Bretton Woods, just after the Second World War. The question was, if I understood it, if Keynes had lived longer, would he have repudiated bits and pieces or the general theory, lock, stock, and barrel? Hayek, I think, was of that view, and there's quotes to the effect that Hayek, in the sort of 1936, 37, 38, immediately after the publication of the general theory, was busy doing other things and decided not to review and to criticize Keynes. Why not? Because Keynes was notorious for changing his mind so frequently that by the time Hayek devoted the time and energy to refute the general theory, Keynes would have gone off and be doing something else. So he thought, that's pointless for me to do. And of course, that didn't occur. There's also in the back of my memory, so I could well be wrong, an unpublished draft article from Keynes to be published in the Journal of Economics, and I could get the journal wrong, in effect to water down some of what he said in the general theory. So the answer to your question could be yes, but I don't know it's counterfactual, we can't know for sure, but in the back of my mind, and others probably know, I keep hitting this thing, there's others who would possibly know better than me, that there are bits and pieces of evidence that what's undeniably true, that Keynes was a notorious mind changer. He changed his mind when it suited him and for reasons best known to him. So it's the answer to your question, yes, it is plausible. Way in the back.
I'd actually just got a comment. I've seen some footage about Hayek talking about Keynes towards the end of his life.
Yep.
So it's some footage of Hayek talking about Keynes, and Hayek and Keynes were in conversation, and he raised various points in Keynes' theory that were going wrong, and Keynes' response was, look, I see the problems, I know where they're going, and what I'll do is I'll just write a piece a bit later and change everyone's mind.
Perhaps next only to Krugman. Keynes was a very self-confident sort of a bloke. So I think we're running up against time. Benjamin, I've missed my schedule. Is it 10 o'clock? Okay. Well, you let me off very easy with your questions. Thanks very much for your questions and your attention. Thank you very much.